Okay, so this video almost never happened because I happen to have allergy and there is someone playing accordion in the street. But I'm gonna try to record anyway. So, things I wish I knew before when it comes to ISO 2701. So the first one is that ISO is a project like any other else. What do I mean by this? So maybe you already saw that as well, but when a company starts to get involved in ISO, they quickly realize it's actually more complicated. And what do they do is that often they will try to find a tool that will give them ISO. And what happens is that sometimes they go to the wrong provider and they don't own the ISO implementation process anymore because they hire this provider. They believe the provider is gonna give them ISO, and they don't try to make the effort of understanding what is required as part of ISO. And I think that's a mistake. You can actually go to a provider, you can hire a consultant, that's fine, do whatever you want. But the thing that's wrong is believing that since you will get some help with the project, you don't have to understand what's required. And often what happens is that we have companies that they hired someone else, they hired a tool, and it didn't work as expected. They lost 1 year, 2 years, and they are at step one again. Why? Because they didn't actually make the effort of understanding what was required to get ISO, and they didn't own the roadmap. And I think that's a wrong mistake. So ISO is a project like any other else, means understand what you need to do, read actually the norm, understand what are the requirements you have to comply with, and then try to see what remains to be done before gaining ISO. But don't expect, I think, a consultant or a tool, you don't expect them to own the roadmap as well. They can help you, but always understand what you need to do first. Okay, so then my second truth is that ISO is tough because you expect it to be easy. That's somehow connected with the first point. But some people believe that they just have to hire a consultant and it will be done for them. And then they quickly realize that actually they won't get ISO in 40 days. I mean, I just want to mention that maybe you can actually get ISO in 40 days, but the king is the context, right? It's not because you hear from someone that you can get ISO in 40 days that you will actually get it in 40 days. Because maybe for your own company, in your context, you might need 10 months, 12 months, 18 months. We don't know. But the thing is that often there are some companies that base their marketing on the idea that they will grant you ISO in 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Who cares? Um, and I think it can create some expectations that are not always healthy when it comes to actually achieving the certification, because people don't believe that at some point they will have to put intense efforts. And so, of course, then they realize that actually there is more needed than than what they thought it was. And so that's at least for the implementation process. But even if they actually work with a company that give them ISO over the course of 6 weeks, let's say, then they actually realize that they have an amount of effort that is to be done on a continuous basis, and they were not ready for that because they just thought that ISO was a tick off the box exercise. And then they happen to have some risk to manage. You have action plans to manage. You have controls to verify often that they're actually operating. So you have to keep your SOA updated. There are so many things they have not been educated on, and they accumulated debt because they wanted to go too fast with ISO. So this is why I'm saying be prepared to the ideal ISO stuff, and I think it's probably gonna help you then going towards actually needs to be done. Then my third truth is your company should have a good reason to go for it. Why am I mentioning this? It's because I think that if you take for granted that ISO is stuff, they actually you actually have to understand that you have to involve the management. You have to at least. So it really depends on the organization of the company here. It can be the CISO, but maybe you won't have a CISO, so it's the CTO, or maybe you don't even have a CTO, or maybe you want to involve the CEO, but you have somebody that will grant you the resources for actually this project to happen. And if you're in a startup, you probably need some engineering resources helping you on the project, depending on the scope, but you will need people that know the assets and can reply to some risk related questions. So you will have to involve people. It will be painful. And this is why I don't like saying that ISO is easy. I think you can make it easier, but it's not easy. Um, but yeah, so I think it takes a lot of resources, and this is why your company should be really clear in the first place on the reason why they are going for ISO. Because then, in tough times where people will be pissed because you actually ask them to complete 30 action plans, or you have a list of 25 actions for just one person because they are the main stakeholders as part of the assets that are the most at risk. You want these people to be really involved and to actually do what they have to do. And this is impossible if, in the first place, there was a superficial reason for the company to go through ISO. And of course, like each company has their own reason. I believe that the most important one usually is to demonstrate trust to clients. So it's more or less for a commercial reason. But and that's totally fine, as long as the reason is good enough for so that in tough times, actually the company can dedicate the right resources to ISO. Okay, then my fourth truth, I like this one, is don't write policies because you're being sold policies. Okay, we know that as part of ISO, policies are important. I'm really far from contesting that, and if you know, I actually have a tool that generate policies. So I'm really not against policies, but I'm against the way policies are generally brought to an organization. The first one is probably with the religious way. Oh, we must have these policies, right? And the thing is that so I mean, people just believe that you must have all policies covering all the topics of your ISMS. That's the first approach. But there are also other people that actually they believe they must have all the policies because they have been sold, let's say, a package of 25 policies by a consultant. So they receive this template that's pretty much generic. They are trying to implement it, to adapt it to the context of their company, just to realize that might be a lot of work for a little return on investment. Why this happens is that because people deeply don't understand why in the first place you would have a policy. And I'm gonna explain you really simply now. Well, I really think that you should implement a policy if it covers a risk. A policy is a set of rules of what the company wants to do on any given topic. So the main implication behind is that if there is no risk, or if the company is not exposed to a risk, we just don't do any policy on this topic. Let's say employee monitoring. Oh, okay, but like the company doesn't even have employees; they only work with contractors. Okay, no employee monitoring policy. That's an example, but you see the point. So this is why in ISO the risk identification step matters. The risk assessment. You have to have policies mainly on the topics where a risk has been identified. And if you can feel when a policy is empty. Sometimes you read the policy of the company and you realize it's not what we do, and it doesn't feel like it's adapted to our context. Okay, this means actually you wrote the policy before making sure it was relevant, and it was not relevant because there was no risk to be covered in the first place. So that's my take on writing policies. Do it, but only if you need to. Then do have all the policies that you want, of course, but first make sure it's needed. Okay, then managing the ISMS feels lonely. Okay, My job is ISMS manager. It just means the guy in charge of the ISO 2701 certification in a company. And I didn't know what it was looking like before. But if there's something I can mention, it's really that it can feel lonely sometimes, because you're the only person that has to actually be knowledgeable on the norm, to read the requirements, to know as well, for example, the structure of the appendix A, to understand the list of controls, to understand what it clearly means to implement ISO. And it means that sometimes the deeper you go with the understanding of the standard, the more you understand that you understand things that people don't understand. So you understand that, for example, two risk assessments are needed as part of ISO. There is one risk assessment for the security risks on the information system, but you also must assess risks and opportunities of the ISMS. That is not the same thing. No. So this is the kind of thing that you are the only person to understand, and you have to push them for your team. You have to push them with the people you work with, and that can be sometimes lonely. The same that if you are the only one making sure that risk treatment plans are actually carried out and in place and relevant and still covering the risks that they were aimed at covering in the first place. Of course, sometimes you're going to be challenged because you are the only one that fundamentally cares, because it's your job. So I didn't expect it to be that lonely, and I think it's important for people to come with the right expectations. And personally, to build to solve this problem, what I do is that first I try to talk to people as much as possible and just let them know that if whatever I'm doing is to keep the certification, now that the certification has been granted to the company, but it's also to make sure that they understand I'm not a cop, and my goal is to keep ISO for the company, but also in a way that is actually sustainable and relevant for the company. And so that if I'm asking them to do something, it's not to bother them, it's because it's probably needed. And this is my take as of today. And to solve some problems that I have, sometimes I have some doubts regarding what to do with a given control. Shall I actually exclude it because it's not covering a risk, or can I just not exclude it because an auditor would find it surprising? Uh, I built a tool called the ISO 2701 Copilot. It's an assistant that is trained on relevant case of ISO implementation, and that helps me to move forward with some doubts that I have. And since of the lonely position, sometimes there's no one else that can answer my reply. And of course, it's not a silver bullet, and there is no silver bullet with ISO. And this is my message: like, you always have to do the work, and probably nobody's gonna do the work, the fundamental work at your place. Um, but it can just be an assistance to solve some doubts and make sure that you can just move on to the next step, which is what matters. Okay, then point six: don't implement blindly Appendix A controls. Why am I saying this? Um, I really feel that this is a big misunderstanding on ISO certification, and it's just caused by the fact that people are diverse, auditing cultures are really different. We don't do the same things in the UK, in France, in the US, in Spain, in Asia. We really don't do the same thing. There are different ways to interpret how to actually implement ISO. But the point is that oftentimes some people expect that all the controls, the 93 controls of Appendix A in the latest version of ISO 27, must be implemented. They expect that they should implement the 93 controls of this appendix. And so it creates a lot of stress. They're like, wow, that's a bit overwhelming. And okay, I don't know, data retention. I'm not yet at this stage to data retention. Or They just identified that there are 11 new controls in the latest version of the standard, and they get stressed about that because they might not be as prepared as they think they need to be prepared. And this is where actually a deeper understanding of the ISO standards let you understand that you don't need to apply all the controls of the appendix A. You need to look at the appendix A, this list of 93 controls, and you need to compare your security controls implemented on your ISMS or that you wish you implemented on your ISMS, and you need to compare them against this appendix A to understand what you should pick or not pick based on your context, on your ISMS, on your risks. That's the exercise that ISO requires you to do. So it means that you might have controls that are from not an ISO origin. And it means that you're gonna say no to some ISO controls. We don't apply this because it's not relevant to the context and the risks of our organization. And I think this point is really often we just forget about it. And then we have people running after the clock, and they just are overwhelmed because they didn't scope appropriately their controls. And this is often because of a lack of understanding of the standard. Okay, lack of ambition and overkill can both make you fail. What do I mean? It's that if you have a wrong understanding of the standard, what can literally happen is that you will take the wrong direction. So there are two ways to do this. The first one is you can overkill. And I think that it's a risk that, especially if you're new to the standard, I'm not talking to a 20-year consultant that is probably super familiar with the standard, even though misunderstanding can happen at every stage. But a biggest risk is overkilling ISO by asking too much that what's actually needed to the stakeholders. Let's say you identified 40 priority risks and you establish 40 risk treatment plans. Uh, and there is actually only three people that will be the owners of these action plans. So you will end up with, on average, more than 10 action plans per person. And maybe one person is more important as a stakeholder to respond to this risk and might have 20 action plans they are owner of. And they have 1 year, no more, to respond to implement these action plans. Imagine that. Of course, it's a lot. Of course, it's overwhelming. And it happens that it's not the only job of these people because it's not that they can dedicate their day to ISO. They have other day-to-day priorities. They have to hire people. They have to keep the system up and running. Often there is a context to the ISO implementation, and people are really busy. So this is why overkilling ISO can be a risk. I think it's often underappreciated. But actually, as an ISMS manager, making sure so ISMS manager is just the person in charge of keeping or maintaining or getting ISO 27. That's all. And I think it's the role of this person to make sure that the efforts conducted by the company are proportionate, meaning that you are actually treating the risks and maintaining conformity with ISO in a way that is sustainable so that you keep people engaged. Okay? Because otherwise, by overkilling, it's actually you're compromising both the certification but also security because people won't be putting the efforts where it actually needs to be done for your ISMS to be relevant. Okay, then the counterpart is lack of ambition. That's of course also a risk with ISO. Lack of ambition can look like when there is an identification of risks and you realize that at first glance that it's not actually the biggest risks on the assets of the ISMS. For example, I don't know, if you are a platform that handles transactions, if you don't have a biggest risk, that is an availability risk, like failure of the platform, and oh, are we gonna recover from this failure rapidly because we need to serve clients rapidly. If you don't have risks the big risks that seem to be the most relevant for the scope of the ISMS. It probably means that at some point we lacked ambition in the process. Was it in the identification of the risk? Was it in the definition of risk treatment plans that are too shallow? You can feel it. I don't want to enter too specifically on what can be lacking of ambition, but it can happen for sure, and it's the two risks you have to make sure you're aware of. It's the lack of ambition and the overkilling. Both can make you fail. Okay, then connected with what I mentioned before, but it's the fact that ISO 27 is about people, not documentation. And this can be really counterintuitive because it's true that we talk a lot about documentation. We talk about the scope, we talk about the policies, the procedures, the statement of applicability. A lot of things have to be documented as part of ISO. That's sure. But when you realize what's the job of an ISMS manager over the long term, especially, I mean, already before the organization gets certified, but even after, you realize that and this is why I talk a lot about life after ISO, because I think that part of the ISO project really starts after ISO, when you need to maintain the ISMS relevant for the company and operating effectively. And this is where you realize it's importantly a people question. Why? Because how do you have a relevant identification of risk? You need to put people around the table because they know the assets, they know the context, they know the resources they have. So you need people around the table to identify the risks. Same thing for the risk treatment plan. You need people to take action to actually solve the risks that have been identified. You need people for so many things. You want to update the statement of applicability. You're not gonna do it by yourself. You must have the input of the key stakeholders to understand what current of controls are still implemented in the company, and to keep things accurate. Same for the risk metrics. If you have metrics that somehow are established to measure how the ISMS is performing, you need people to provide you with the indicators, and you cannot get all this by yourself. So, neglecting this aspect can lead to a failure. Failure doesn't mean necessarily that the organization will lose ISO. If it has been certified, it doesn't mean as well that the company won't be certified if they were preparing for the ISO certification. But I mean failure in the sense that over the long run it can cost you to neglect the fact that ISO is a people thing. And I'm mentioning this because I'm the first one exposed to these risks. Sometimes you're just in your mind, you just see the 35 action plans that need to be carried out, and you just push on people so that you're sure they will do what they must be doing. But the thing is that this is where using more empathy actually helped me, because I understood that these people were really busy. So I understood that my role was to make sure I keep the actions proportionate and I don't overkill, but I don't lack ambition as well. So this is why proportionality is so important, and this is why I believe don't neglect the fact that you're working with people, and this is an important point because people want to be happy about ISO. They want to feel like they are actually protecting the company and demonstrating trust to the customer, but without actually creating a second day of work just to maintain the ISMS. It must be implemented as part of the process of the company. So, and it's super hard to actually implement, to actually make feel like ISO process are so implemented in the company that preparing for ISO or maintaining ISO doesn't feel like an extra work that you have to do on the weekend. And this is the goal of the ISMS manager, to make things proportionate. Okay, and then 9, gap analysis is not just the controls. There there are many different versions of what a gap analysis is as part of ISO. Gap analysis, what it shows that often it's at the beginning of the ISO project, usually when consultant enters the company and wants to understand what's actually going on already, where is the company standing between know the situation right now and tomorrow where they want to get ISO certified. What do they have to do? Often, gap analysis means looking at SOA and looking at each control and seeing how the company is doing on the 93 controls of the SOA, of the Appendix A. And the thing is that this approach can be neglecting the fact that ISO certification is mostly about implementing the requirements of the standard. So of course, if you want to go through the list of all the controls and already assessing how you're doing, okay, that's fine. But you have to keep in mind that actually being ISO certified originally means conforming with the requirements of ISO. So the gap analysis should mainly focus on what derives from the compliance with the requirements 4 to 10. And yes, you can also look at actually at the controls in the appendix A. Yeah, you can do this, but the thing is that later in the ISO project you also will select the controls that are relevant to cover the risks. So if at the beginning you want to make sure that the company is assessed against all the controls, the 93 controls of the Appendix A, you might be losing a bit your time because actually then you will only need to select the controls that are relevant for the company and its context. So pragmatically, what shall we looking for in the gap analysis? It's mainly the conformity with the requirements, the clause 4 to 10, and also asking the company, what is, can you show me your security controls that you implemented today? And and of course they can be compared with the Appendix A analysis, but looking at the gap analysis from the standpoint where the company should actually implement all of the 93 controls from the Appendix A. This is the thing I believe to be wrong, and I wanted to make it clear. Okay, you're not done with ISO 27 once you're certified. I believe this is understandable, but you know, we often present ISO as a milestone. While the focus should really be put on the fact that it's a system. Um, what happens is that people, once they are ISO achieved, everybody in the company is happy, everybody congratulates them, and they think they can take vacation for a couple of months. And okay, of course, you have the right to take vacation. But we often forget and we don't have the right expectations because we believe that ISO is a one-off, and we actually there is almost no resource on how to keep ISO once you got it. And the thing is that people running the ISMS then understand that once they got through the audit, they have corrective action plans, they have risk treatment plans because they did a risk analysis last year. They have ISMS indicators somehow that they must be looking at. They have procedures and policies to update because they were probably not perfect and they still need to be updated because documentation in your ISMS just needs to be kept relevant. And they have the list of requirements from the clause that they must keep be looking at this list of requirements to make sure they actually keep maintaining conformity with these requirements. So, and if you expect the job to be done once you're ISO certified, you are completely forgetting that ISO is maintenance over time of a performing ISMS, and I think it can lead you to actually neglect the amount of work that there will be after certification. So I just want to prepare you. There will be work, probably more work. The more you understand the standard, there will be some work. Not necessarily to always do more, but just to make sure your ICMS is relevant, and that's the key. And that's the next point I want to mention. It's relevance over checklist mentality. When I started with getting ISO, I was obsessed about the checklist, and I still operate a lot with checklist. Okay, this is what we exactly have to do before the internal audit, for example. This is I really operate like this because it makes things easy for everybody. They just know what they have to do, and then they just do it. So easy. But the thing is that as an ISMS manager, I can give as much as checklists, as many as checklists as I want to my people, but I need to understand personally that it's not only about we have to do this, but it's also about the selection of actually actions that need to be done. And this is my proper job, is to make sure that when I say this is what we have to do over the next 3 months, that actually we have to do it. I'm giving you an example. If I'm saying we have to review 22 operating procedures of the ISMS, so it's like we have big ISMS documents like the scope. Then we have information security policy. We have a lot of policies, and then you have the standard operating procedures that they are more supposed to be representing exactly how actions are conducted. It's not about what we should do, but how we do it. And if I'm saying over the next 2 months, we have to review these 22 procedures, like, am I making sure actually there's a rule that is saying that in the company, or am I making sure somehow that it's exactly what the ISO standard want in a clause? So you have to be always super critical about what needs to be done and how is this connected to the standard. And I think often people that are managing an ISMS are not prepared to that because they got ISO in a context where they were not owning the process. This is what we were mentioning at the beginning, but they, for example, hire the consultants, so they never try to deeply understand what is actually needed as part of the ISO project, but also, and most importantly, what is not needed, because sometimes things won't be needed. You don't need to review all the documents every quarter. The requirement is that you review your documentation regularly, but you also have to define within your own system what is the rule for reviewing each document. So you cannot just blindly say, let's review 20 procedures each every 6 months, every now you have to understand the rules you define in your company. You have to understand the rules that are that come from the requirements of ISO, and then you operate from these rules to have an ISMS that is relevant and proportionate to the amount of efforts and the amount of resources that are required to protect your company. That's all. Um, Finally, life after ISO is full of distractions. Don't forget the standard. After I got involved in an ISO certification process, and let's say that the company got certified, often my fault comes on fixing the action plans, because we identify many risks, we identify corrective action plans. So my focus is really on this. But the thing is that by focusing too much on the controls, on solving the risk, which is a really good thing in itself, okay, even reviewing documentation as well, I forget that there's compliance with the clauses of the standard. Of course, for example, if you implement risk treatment plan, you're already complying with a clause of the standard. But um, actually going in the standard, going to each requirement, just reading again the clause 4 to 10 and asking, okay, uh, am I complying with 9.3? I believe 9.3 is management review. Did we actually include all the documents we wanted the management to review in the management review template? Did we do that? And this is something you can easily forget if you put all the attention on the action plans or the corrective action plans from the audits. So make sure you still look at everything that needs to be updated. Make sure you actually don't forget the main clauses of the standard when you maintain your ISMS, because auditors will come and of course ask questions about your controls, but they will still want to look for your compliance with the standard, because it's actually what ISO is about. So, wow, that was 12 myths, 12 things I wanted to correct on ISO, and I hope you liked it. It was really intense. I actually didn't touch my glass, but now I can rest a bit. Um, if you liked it, just let me know. I'm gonna share over truths in the future, and my truths, of course, not universal truths, but I hope you like the effort. Thanks a lot. Bye.